The call came in just after 9 on a Thursday morning, while I was still sitting at my sister's kitchen table in Sudbury with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me. It was my son. His voice was tight in a way I hadn't heard since he was 17 and had put a dent in my truck backing out of the driveway. "Dad, she found it." I set the mug down slowly. "Found what?" "The deposit box. She knows which branch. She's already in the car." I didn't say anything for a moment. Outside my sister's window, 2 chickadees were fighting over the feeder she'd hung from the birch tree. I watched them and I thought about the last 4 years. About the prenuptial agreement my son's wife had signed without reading. About the specific conversation we'd had, she and I, right before the wedding, when she'd asked me point blank what the box contained, and I'd smiled and told her it was nothing she'd ever need to worry about. I'd meant that in more ways than one. "Let her go," I said. My son went quiet. "Dad, what?" "Let her go, Alec. I've been waiting for this." I should explain who I am before I go any further because I think it matters. My name is Harold. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a contracts lawyer in Ottawa before I retired to a smaller house in Canada with a vegetable garden I still don't fully understand, and more time on my hands than I'd anticipated. My wife, Alec's mother, passed away 11 years ago. Breast cancer, caught late. After she died, I threw myself back into work for about 3 years, which is the wrong thing to do, but also the only thing I knew how to do. When I finally stopped, when I actually let myself breathe, I made a list of everything I wanted to protect. Not a financial list, a life list. The things I'd built, the things I'd saved, the things Eleanor had cared about, the small cottage on the lake near Calabogie that she'd chosen herself, the photographs, the letters she'd written to me when I was articling in Toronto and she was still finishing her degree in Kingston. I organized all of it carefully, and what couldn't fit in the house I kept somewhere safe. My son is a good man. He has his mother's instincts about people, which means he is warm and open and occasionally, tragically, wrong. He fell in love with his wife Petra at a conference in Vancouver 3 years before they married. She was polished and charming and knew exactly how to be exactly what any room needed her to be. I'd seen that type before. 31 years of contract law will introduce you to every variety of person, and I recognized her the way you recognize a clause in a lease that seems generous until you read the subtext. I didn't say anything at first. I watched. I took notes, not literally, but in the way a careful person does, storing things, filing them, remembering the small inconsistencies, the way she went quiet when money wasn't the topic, the way she redirected every conversation about the future back toward assets, inheritance, what things were worth. The way she looked at my cottage the first time Alec brought her up in the summer, standing on the dock with her sunglasses on, doing math I wasn't supposed to notice. Before the wedding, I sat with my own lawyer, and we restructured things carefully. The cottage went into a family trust with conditions that couldn't be altered by a spouse, only by direct descendants. The investment accounts were rewritten. The joint assets Alec and I had shared informally were formalized and protected. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was simply making sure that what my wife and I had spent a lifetime building couldn't be disassembled in a year or two by someone who'd never contributed a single hour to any of it. Petra signed the prenuptial agreement at the kitchen table of their condo in Sentrytown. She barely glanced at it. I sat across from her and watched her pen move across the page, and I thought, she thinks this is temporary. She thinks she has time. She thinks she'll find another way in. The safe deposit box at the branch on Bank Street had been mine for 22 years. Eleanor had known about it. Alec did not. I'd never told him what was inside, not because I was hiding anything from my son, but because it was never the right time, and honestly, because I'd wanted to see what would happen when the wrong person went looking. Petra had been trying to find it for at least 18 months. I knew this because my son, without realizing it, had mentioned several times that she'd ask questions. Where do you keep important documents? Does your dad have a lawyer in Ottawa still? What happens to the cottage if something happens to your dad? Alec heard curiosity. I heard a woman drawing a map. She'd found the box number 6 weeks earlier. I don't know exactly how. Probably she'd gone through Alec's files at home, or found an old statement I'd left at the house years ago. It didn't matter. When Alec told me, I asked him to say nothing to her. I told him I was handling it. He trusted me. though I could hear in his voice that the trust was getting thin. I called the branch manager that same day. Elaine, a woman I dealt with for almost a decade. I explained what I needed. She was cautious at first, professionally cautious, but when I explained the situation fully and asked her simply to call me the moment anyone attempted to access the box, she agreed. She also agreed to one other thing, which I'll get to. So when my son called me from his car in Sudbury and told me Petra was on her way to the bank, I was not surprised. I was ready. I told him to go to the branch, not to confront her, not to say anything, just to be there, to watch. He didn't understand, but he went. I finished my coffee. I called Elaine. I told her it was happening and that Alec would be arriving shortly and that she should proceed exactly as we'd discussed. Then I called my sister into the kitchen and explained why I needed her to drive me to the bus station, because I'd taken the train up 2 days ago and didn't have a car. She looked at me for a long moment. My sister has always been sharper than she lets on. "You've been waiting for this," she said. "Since the wedding," I told her. She grabbed her keys without another word. Petra arrived at the branch at 10:43 in the morning. I know the exact time because Elaine told me afterward methodically, the way people do when they've been part of something they want to make sure they remember correctly. She walked in and asked to access the box. She had documentation, a letter apparently claiming she was acting with power of attorney on my behalf. Elaine examined it. She asked Petra to wait. She took the document to the back. Alec arrived 8 minutes later. He came through the front door and saw his wife sitting in the waiting area near the private banking desks, and she saw him, and neither of them said anything right away. He told me later it was the look on her face that started it. Not guilt, exactly. More like calculation. Like she was already deciding what to say. The power of attorney document was a forgery, not a sophisticated one. My lord confirmed it within an hour of seeing a photograph. Someone had taken my name and a notarized signature from an old document, probably something Petra had photographed when going through the filing cabinet at Alec's place, and attached it to a letter that purported to give her access to my financial holdings. This is where I need to explain what Elaine had agreed to. She did not call the police immediately. That had been my instruction. Instead, she came out and told Petra, very calmly, that there appeared to be a discrepancy with the paperwork and that she'd need to verify it before proceeding. She invited Petra back to a private office. She also invited Alec. I want to be clear that I didn't plan what happened next to be cruel. I'm not a cruel person, but I had spent 4 years watching my son love someone who was keeping a ledger in her head, and I had tried twice to have a direct conversation with him about it. And both times he defended her in the way people do when they're still inside the feeling. You can't argue someone out of a belief they arrived at through emotion. You have to let them see it themselves. So I had asked Elaine to do one simple thing. If Petra came in with documentation, verify it in front of Alec. That's all. Don't accuse, don't explain. Just let him be in the room when the discrepancy was identified. She did exactly that. Alec told me the whole thing later that evening on the phone. His voice had changed by then. Quieter. Older somehow. He said Petra had been composed at first. She'd explained the document, cited some story about an emergency, said I'd asked her to handle this because I was traveling. Elaine had nodded and asked a few gentle questions. And then she put the document on the table next to a scan of my actual signature from the bank's own files and asked Petra if she'd like to compare them. Petra had looked at the two signatures side by side, and then she'd looked at Alec. He said he watched her face go through 3 or 4 different things in about 2 seconds, and then she picked up her purse and started to stand up, and he put his hand on the table, not touching her, just flat on the table, and said very quietly, "Don't." That word, he told me, surprised him as much as it surprised her. Elaine had stepped out to give them a moment. The police were called eventually. That was unavoidable once a forged document had been submitted, and Elaine had a duty to report it. But in that room, before any of that, my son and his wife sat across from each other, and Alec asked her one question. What was worth doing this for? She didn't answer, which was, I suppose, its own kind of answer. I got back to Ottawa 2 days later. Alec picked me up at the train station on Tremblay Road, which he almost never does anymore, because parking is a nightmare, and he hates downtown traffic. He was standing by his car when I came through the doors, and he looked, honestly, like he hadn't slept much. He'd shaved, though. Put on a decent jacket. He's his mother's son that way. Takes care of his appearance when things are falling apart like it's the one thing he can control. We drove for a while without saying much. I'm comfortable with quiet, and so is he. That's one of the better things I passed on to him. Eventually, he said, "Did you know she was going to go that far?" I thought about it honestly before I answered. I thought she might. I hoped she wouldn't. I'd prepare for the case that she would. Why didn't you tell me? Because you wouldn't have believed me, and I needed you to see it for yourself. He nodded slowly. I watched the city go by. It was a gray November afternoon, the kind Ottawa does particularly well, all bare trees and the smell of wet leaves and the river somewhere off in the distance looking cold. I feel like an idiot, he said. You're not an idiot. You loved someone. That's not stupidity. She had me convinced you were keeping things from me to control me. I looked at him. Was there any part of you that believed that? He was quiet for a moment. Sometimes. Yeah. That was honest, and I appreciated it. I told him so. What's in the box? He asked. I'd been expecting that. Your mother's letters. The one she wrote me when we were still long distance, before we were married. Some photographs from before you were born. The original deed to the cottage. And a letter I wrote to you about 15 years ago that I never knew quite when to give you. He didn't say anything for a long time after that. We stopped at a Lebanese place on Richmond Road that we'd been going to together since he was in university, and we sat in a booth near the back and ordered the same things we always order, and somewhere in the middle of the meal, he started crying, quietly, in the way men his age sometimes do when they've been holding something for too long and a plate of familiar food is the thing that finally opens it. I didn't say anything. I just let him. The letter, when I finally gave it to him that evening at my house, was 4 pages long. I'd written it the year after Eleanor died, when Alec was 24 and working his first real job, and I wasn't sure, in the dark part of that grief, how well I'd done as a father. I'd written everything I wished I'd said out loud, about his mother, about the kind of man I'd tried to be, about the things I hoped he'd look for in a life, and the things I hoped he'd learn to recognize and avoid. I don't know exactly what he made of it, because he read it alone in the spare room while I sat in the kitchen and listened to the radio at low volume. But when he came out, his eyes were red and he stood in the doorway for a moment and then said, "You should have given this to me a long time ago." "Maybe," I said, "but I think you needed to be ready for it." Petra's lawyer contacted mine the following week about the forgery. The situation was resolved quietly, partly because Alec asked me to let it be quiet for his own sake, and I respected that. The marriage had lasted 3 years. The prenuptial agreement held. She left with what she'd come in with. The BMW. She'd been driving Alec's car for 2 years, treated it like her own, took it to the dealership for service, and put it on his account. He asked for that back on a Tuesday, and she left it in the parking lot of their building, with the key on the front seat. He sold it within the week. The cottage is still in the trust. My granddaughter, Alec's daughter from a relationship years ago that I always wished he'd taken more seriously, will inherit it one day. Her name is Bria. She's 9 years old, and she caught her first bass off the dock last August and made me take about 15 photographs of it before she'd agree to throw it back. Eleanor would have adored her. Alec is doing better. He moved back to a smaller place in the glebe, closer to Bria's school. He calls more than he used to. We've had dinner 3 times in the past month, which is more than the entire previous year combined. He asked me once in one of those late conversations whether I'd felt any satisfaction when everything came out the way it did. The question surprised me. I thought about it carefully because that's the kind of question that deserves care, and I told him the truth, not satisfaction. Relief. The same relief you feel when a storm you've been watching build for a long time finally arrives and you're inside, and the roof holds, and everyone you love is safe. The box is still at the branch on Bank Street. I haven't decided yet whether to move its contents. Some things are fine right where they are. There's a version of this story where I'm the controlling father, the man who couldn't let his son live his own life, who maneuvered and schemed and treated his family like a board game. I understand why someone might tell it that way, but I was also a man who watched his wife die and spent the years after trying to make sure that everything she and I had built together would last past the both of us. That's not control. That's love with a long time horizon. My son knows that now. That's enough. I've been thinking about what Alex said to me on the drive back from the train station. He said he felt like an idiot, and I told him he wasn't, because he wasn't. But I've kept turning it over since then. The way you turn a stone in your hand without quite knowing why. The thing about Petra was that she wasn't stupid. That's what people miss when they hear a story like this. They picture greed as something clumsy and obvious, some cartoon version of a person rubbing their hands together. But the people who come into your life looking for what they can take, they're often charming, often perceptive, often very good at reading what a room needs. What she lacked wasn't intelligence. It was integrity, and that gap between being clever and being decent is one of the most dangerous spaces a person can occupy. Because cleverness without a moral compass doesn't stay still. It moves. It looks for openings. I didn't build the trust, restructure the accounts, or set up the deposit box out of suspicion for its own sake. I did it because I understood after 31 years reading contracts that the difference between a fair agreement and an exploitive one usually comes down to whether both people in the room are operating in good faith. When one of them isn't, all the warmth and love in the world won't protect you. You have to build the structure that holds, regardless of what the other person decides to do. That's not cynicism. That's what I'd call clear-eyed steadiness, the willingness to prepare for the worst while still hoping for the better thing. Alec had his mother's warmth, and I'd always been grateful for it. But warmth needs something underneath it, something that doesn't bend when it's tested. He'd never quite developed that. Not because he was weak, but because he'd never been forced to. I'd made things comfortable enough that he hadn't needed to build that part of himself. That's the part I carry. If I'm honest with myself, and I try to be, I wonder sometimes whether the way I protected him when he was younger made it harder for him to see the shape of what was coming. You can give your children safety, or you can give them knowledge. Ideally, you find a way to give them both. I'm not sure I always got the balance right. What I do know is that the moment he put his hand flat on that table in the bank and said, "Don't," to his wife, that was something he found in himself, not something I gave him. Whatever steadiness lives in him now, he built it in that room, under pressure, when it mattered. That takes something. It takes the kind of resolve that nobody hands you and nobody can manufacture for you. It either shows up when you need it, or it doesn't. It showed up. The letters Eleanor wrote me are still in the box. I think I'll bring them home soon. Some things have been kept safe long enough. It might be time to let them back into the light.